Hey friends, tonight we're stepping into a quieter, stranger past. Not a battlefield, not a plague pit, but something far more personal. We're talking about love, courtship, desire, and what hooking up really meant in medieval times. Spoiler, it wasn't romantic, and it wasn't safe. There were no roses, no candlelit dinners, only rules, reputations, and the ever watchful eye of the church. So dim the lights. Maybe pull up your blanket a little tighter. And if this slow, strange dive into forgotten lives helps you rest, feel free to like and subscribe. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, take a deep breath because medieval love was rarely lovely. Let's begin. So, Meyer picture this. It's 1347. The sun has long since disappeared behind the stone walls of a small English village. Inside a modest cottage, wooden shutters creak softly in the evening breeze. A young woman named Agnes sits by the dying embers of her family's hearth, spinning wool by the faint orange glow. She's 22, practically an old maid by medieval standards. Her fingers work the spindle with practiced ease, but her mind wanders to the cooper's son who smiled at her after Sunday Mass. Just a smile, nothing more. But in her world, even that simple gesture carries weight, consequence, danger. You see, in medieval times, what we might casually call hooking up was a labyrinth of social rules, religious doctrine, and very real physical peril. There was no privacy, no anonymity, no escape from the watchful eyes of neighbors, family, and clergy who saw sin in every shadow. Let's drift back further to understand how different their world truly was. In the year 1200, most people lived in villages of maybe 50 to 100 souls. Everyone knew everyone. Your business was everyone's business. A young woman couldn't simply slip away for a romantic encounter without someone noticing. The baker's wife, the blacksmith's apprentice, the parish priest, making his evening rounds. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about land, livestock, and lineage. Parents arranged unions based on practical considerations: who owned the adjacent field, who had the healthiest pigs, who could provide the best dowry. Romance, if it existed at all, was expected to bloom after the wedding, not before. But humans, being humans, still felt desire, still yearned for connection, still found ways to steal moments of intimacy despite the rigid social structure surrounding them. The church taught that any sexual activity outside marriage was a mortal sin. Priests delivered sermons about the dangers of lust, the corruption of the flesh, the pathway to eternal damnation. Fear was their primary tool of control, and it worked, mostly. But in the quiet spaces between official doctrine and human nature, things happened. They always do. Young people found each other at harvest festivals, where ale flowed freely and dancing loosened inhibitions. They met during the brief twilight hours, when farm work was done, but darkness hadn't yet fallen. They passed notes through trusted friends, used coded glances during church services, invented reasons to visit the same market stalls. Agnes, our wool-spinning maiden, might have encountered the cooper's son at the village well. Water had to be drawn daily, and the well was one of the few places where unmarried men and women could legitimately cross paths. If she timed her evening water gathering just right, she might find herself alone with him for precious minutes. Their courtship, if you could call it that, would unfold in whispers and glances. Perhaps he would help her carry her heavy water jug back to her cottage. Maybe their hands would brush as he steadied the rope. Small touches that sent electricity through their bodies, even as they maintained careful distance. The physical realities of medieval life made intimate encounters particularly challenging. Most people lived in single-room dwellings with their entire families. Privacy was a luxury that simply didn't exist. Even the wealthy, who might have multiple rooms in their manor houses, shared sleeping spaces with servants, relatives, and guests. So where did couples go? The answer reveals the desperation behind medieval desire. Haylofts, empty stables, the shadowy corners of barns where grain was stored, the edges of forests where paths disappeared into undergrowth. These became the trysting places of medieval lovers, uncomfortable, cold, often dangerous locations where passion had to compete with the very real risk of discovery. And discovery meant ruin. For women especially, the consequences were severe. A woman caught in a compromising position might find herself branded as a whore, unmarriageable, cast out from her family and community. She might be forced to do public penance, walking barefoot through the village while the priest recited her sins for all to hear. Men faced consequences too, but they were often less severe. A man might pay a fine to the church or to the woman's family. He might be required to marry her if she became pregnant, but his reputation, his future prospects, his place in society, these remained largely intact. This double standard shaped every aspect of medieval sexuality. Women learned to be cautious, secretive, terrified of the consequences of desire. Men learned that their actions had fewer personal repercussions, though they still risked the wrath of fathers, brothers, and husbands. Let's pause here for a moment and consider what hooking up actually meant in practical terms. There was no reliable birth control, no understanding of sexually transmitted diseases, no antibiotics to treat infections, no safe abortions if pregnancy occurred. Every sexual encounter carried the risk of pregnancy, and pregnancy outside marriage was a social catastrophe. Women used folk remedies to prevent conception, herbal teas, amulets, prayers to specific saints. They tried to time their encounters around their menstrual cycles, though their understanding of fertility was limited and often incorrect. They inserted pieces of wool soaked in various substances into their bodies, hoping to create a barrier against pregnancy. None of these methods were reliable. Medieval records show many cases of unwed mothers, abandoned babies, and desperate women seeking dangerous remedies to end unwanted pregnancies. The church response was harsh, but predictable. Pregnant, unwed women were forced to publicly confess their sins, often while standing in the church doorway during Sunday services. They might be whipped, fined, or exiled from the community. Their children, if they survived, carried the stigma of illegitimacy throughout their lives. But still, people found ways to be together. The human need for connection, for physical intimacy, for emotional bonding, proved stronger than fear of punishment. Some couples practiced forms of intimacy that stopped short of full intercourse. Medieval theological texts reveal that church authorities were aware of these practices and disapproved of them, but they were seen as lesser sins than complete consummation outside marriage. Bundling was a common practice in some regions. Young couples would be allowed to sleep in the same bed, but fully clothed and often with a wooden board between them. This was supposed to allow emotional intimacy while preventing physical temptation. As you might imagine, it didn't always work as intended. Hand fasting was another semi-official practice. A couple would clasp hands and exchange vows in front of witnesses, creating a form of temporary marriage that could be dissolved if things didn't work out. This gave some social protection to couples who wished to be intimate, though it wasn't recognized by the church. The economics of medieval life also shaped romantic relationships. Most people couldn't afford to marry until their late 20s or early 30s, when they had accumulated enough resources to establish an independent household. This meant long years of suppressed desire, of stolen moments, of relationships that existed in the shadows of social disapproval. Agnes might have spent a decade yearning for the cooper's son, meeting him in secret, sharing brief embraces in hidden corners, all while knowing that their relationship couldn't become official until he inherited his father's workshop and she received her small portion of the family land. During these long courtships, physical intimacy developed slowly, carefully, always with the awareness that discovery could destroy everything they hoped to build together. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life provided natural opportunities for romance. Spring festivals celebrated fertility and renewal. Summer brought long evenings when work could continue past sunset. Autumn harvest celebrations loosened social restrictions temporarily. Even winter, harsh as it was, created opportunities for couples to find warmth together. But these moments of connection were always shadowed by the knowledge that medieval medicine offered little help when things went wrong. Pregnancy complications were often fatal. Sexually transmitted diseases, though not well understood, caused suffering and death. Even minor infections could become life-threatening without proper treatment. The church taught that sexual pleasure itself was sinful, that physical intimacy should be endured rather than enjoyed, that the body was a source of temptation and corruption. This created a psychological burden that modern people can barely comprehend. Every moment of physical pleasure carried the weight of spiritual guilt. Medieval literature reveals that people still found joy in physical intimacy despite these teachings. Love songs from the period celebrate the beauty of bodies, the pleasure of touch, the excitement of secret meetings. But these celebrations were always tinged with awareness of transgression, of rules being broken, of risks being taken. As we drift deeper into this strange medieval world, picture the reality of these encounters. No electric lights, so darkness fell completely when the sun set. No running water, so personal hygiene was limited. No private spaces, so intimacy required creativity and courage. Couples met by moonlight, navigating by memory and starlight. They whispered endearments in languages we can barely understand, using words that carried different meanings, different weights of emotion. They touched each other with hands roughened by manual labor, bodies shaped by physical work, and simple diets. The textures of their world were different too. Wool and linen instead of cotton and silk, wooden surfaces instead of metal and plastic, stone and thatch instead of glass and steel. Their intimate moments unfolded in an environment that was fundamentally alien to modern experience. And yet, the basic human emotions were the same. The flutter of excitement when eyes met across a crowded room, the racing heart when hands accidentally touched, the longing for connection, for understanding, for moments of tenderness in a harsh world. Medieval records sometimes capture these emotions in their raw form. Letters between lovers, poems scratched into church walls, testimony from church courts dealing with cases of adultery or fornication. These sources reveal people who felt desire just as intensely as we do, who took incredible risks for moments of connection, who suffered deeply when relationships ended badly. The Virgin Mary provided a complex model for medieval women. She was revered as the ultimate female figure, but she was also impossible to emulate. She was both mother and virgin, both human and divine. This created an impossible standard that real women could never meet. Some women found ways to navigate these contradictions. They might dedicate themselves to religious life, becoming nuns or mystics. They might embrace motherhood as their primary identity, finding fulfillment in raising children and managing households. They might quietly rebel against social expectations, pursuing relationships and desires despite the risks. The reality is that medieval people, like people in every era, found ways to be human despite the constraints of their society. They fell in love. They desired each other. They found moments of physical and emotional connection. But they did so in a world that offered little privacy, little safety, little acceptance of their basic human needs. As our story winds down, let's return to Agnes, sitting by her dying fire with her wool and her spindle. Tomorrow she will see the cooper's son at the village well. They will smile at each other. Perhaps their hands will touch as he helps her with her water jug. Perhaps they will find a few minutes to talk quietly, to share their hopes and fears. They know the risks. They know the rules. They know the consequences of discovery. But they also know the human need for connection, for intimacy, for love. And like countless couples before and after them, they will find ways to be together, even in a world that offers them little space for romance. The medieval world was harsh, unforgiving, and often dangerous, but it was also populated by people who loved deeply, desired passionately, and found ways to honor their human needs, despite overwhelming social pressure to suppress them. Their stories remind us that the human heart remains constant across centuries, even when the world around it changes completely. In every era, people find ways to connect, to touch, to love. The details change, but the essential human experience remains the same, and perhaps in understanding their struggles, we can better appreciate the freedoms we have today, the privacy, the safety, the social acceptance that allows us to love more openly, more safely, more fully than our medieval ancestors ever could. So there you have it, friends. Medieval romance in all its complicated, dangerous, deeply human reality. If this journey through the past has helped you wind down for the night, I'm grateful you shared this time with me. Rest well, and I'll see you in the next video. Chapter 1: Courtly Love and Cold Realities. When you think of medieval romance, your mind probably conjures images of knights in shining armor, fair maidens in tall towers, and passionate love letters written by candlelight. This vision of courtly love has been painted for us through centuries of literature, from the tales of King Arthur to modern fantasy novels. But as we settle into this quiet exploration of medieval intimacy, we need to separate the beautiful myths from the much more complex realities that shaped how people actually connected with each other in those distant times. The concept of courtly love emerged in the 12th century, primarily in the courts of southern France. It was a literary and cultural movement that celebrated a very specific type of romantic relationship. Picture the grand halls of Eleanor of Aquitaine's court, where troubadours would gather to sing elaborate songs about love that was pure, noble, and often unattainable. These weren't simple love songs as we might understand them today. They were complex narrative poems that told stories of knights who would dedicate their entire lives to serving a lady, often from afar, often without any hope of their love being returned. The troubadours created an entire mythology around this type of love. They sang of knights who would undergo incredible hardships just to catch a glimpse of their beloved. They told stories of men who would fight dragons, cross oceans, and endure years of exile simply to prove their devotion to a woman who might never even speak to them directly. This was love elevated to an art form, a spiritual practice, almost a religion in itself. In these songs and poems, the beloved was always described in the most ethereal terms. Her skin was like alabaster, her hair like spun gold, her eyes like the clearest mountain lakes. She was not quite human in these descriptions, but rather a perfect ideal of feminine beauty and virtue. The knight who loved her was similarly idealized. He was brave beyond measure, pure of heart, and completely devoted to his lady's honor. His love made him a better person, a more noble warrior, a more devout Christian. But here's where the reality becomes more complex. These beautiful songs and poems weren't describing actual relationships that people were having. They were describing a fantasy, an impossible ideal that was meant to inspire and entertain rather than guide real behavior. The courts where these stories were told were places of political intrigue, arranged marriages, and very practical considerations about land, wealth, and power. Eleanor of Aquitaine herself, who was one of the great patronesses of courtly love literature, had been married twice for purely political reasons. Her first marriage to Louis VII of France was arranged when she was just 15 years old, designed to unite their territories and strengthen both kingdoms. When that marriage was annulled, she married Henry II of England, again for political advantage. These weren't love matches in any romantic sense, but business arrangements between powerful families. The ladies who were celebrated in courtly love poetry were often married women, wives of powerful lords and nobles. The knights who supposedly loved them were frequently younger men, second or third sons, who had little prospect of inheriting land or titles. This created a fascinating dynamic where the expression of romantic love was safe precisely because it could never be consummated. A young knight could dedicate poems to his lord's wife without threatening the social order, because everyone understood that this was a literary game rather than a real romantic pursuit. The rules of courtly love were elaborate and specific. The lover was expected to suffer in silence, to pine for his beloved without demanding anything in return. He might write her letters, but only to express his devotion and perhaps to ask for some small token of her regard. A glove, a ribbon, a pressed flower. These tiny gestures took on enormous significance in the courtly love tradition because they were often the only tangible connection between the lover and his beloved. The beloved, for her part, was expected to be gracious but distant. She might acknowledge her admirer's devotion with a kind word or a gentle smile, but she was never to encourage him too much or give him false hope. She was supposed to inspire him to greater nobility through her very inaccessibility. Her virtue was demonstrated not by returning his love, but by maintaining proper boundaries while still showing appreciation for his devotion. This created a strange paradox at the heart of courtly love. The most perfect love was the love that could never be fulfilled. The greatest devotion was the devotion that asked for nothing in return. Success in courtly love meant learning to find joy in yearning, satisfaction in service, and fulfillment in the very act of loving someone who would always remain just beyond reach. But what about the people who weren't part of this elaborate courtly game? What about the vast majority of medieval people who lived far from the elegant courts where troubadours sang their sophisticated songs? For them, the realities of courtship and marriage were shaped by very different concerns. In the villages and towns where most people lived, courtship was a much more practical affair. Young people didn't have the luxury of pining for impossible loves or dedicating their lives to unrequited devotion. They needed to find partners who could help them survive in a harsh world, who could work alongside them to build a life together, who could bear and raise children in safety. The freedom to choose one's own romantic partners was a privilege that very few medieval people enjoyed. For the nobility, marriages were diplomatic arrangements designed to strengthen alliances between families, consolidate landholdings, or secure political advantages. A noble daughter might be betrothed in childhood to a man she had never met, someone chosen by her father based on his assessment of what would best serve the family's interests. For the common people, the constraints were different but equally real. A peasant family couldn't afford to let their children marry for love if that love didn't also make economic sense. A young woman needed to marry someone who could support her and any children they might have. A young man needed to marry someone who could contribute to the household economy through her skills, her family connections, or her small dowry. This meant that courtship among ordinary people was often a careful negotiation between families as much as it was a romantic connection between individuals. Parents would evaluate potential matches based on their assessment of the other family's character, resources, and reputation. They would consider whether the young people seemed compatible, but compatibility was measured in practical terms rather than romantic ones. A good match was one where both parties could contribute to the household's prosperity and stability. Could the young man provide adequate shelter and food? Could the young woman manage a household, bear healthy children, and perhaps contribute a skill like weaving or brewing? Did both families have good reputations in the community? Were they known to be honest, hardworking, and devout? Even when young people were allowed some say in their choice of partners, their options were severely limited by their social position. A peasant girl couldn't realistically hope to marry a merchant's son, much less a member of the nobility. A craftsman's apprentice couldn't court the daughter of a wealthy landowner. The social hierarchies of medieval society were rigid and rarely crossed, especially when it came to marriage. The church added another layer of complexity to medieval courtship. Christian doctrine taught that marriage was a sacrament, a sacred bond that could only be dissolved by death. This made the choice of a spouse even more weighty because it was understood to be a lifelong commitment. Young people were encouraged to pray for guidance in choosing a partner, to seek the advice of their priests, and to consider not just their earthly happiness, but their spiritual welfare. The church also had very specific ideas about what constituted proper courtship behavior. Young people were discouraged from spending time alone together before marriage. They were warned against the dangers of physical intimacy outside of marriage. They were taught that even passionate feelings within marriage should be moderated and controlled, that excessive desire was a form of sin even between husband and wife. This created a strange tension in medieval courtship. Young people were expected to choose partners wisely, but they were given very little opportunity to really get to know their potential spouses before marriage. They might meet at church, at community celebrations, or through family connections, but always under the watchful eyes of parents and community members. Private conversations were rare, and physical contact was strictly limited. The result was that many medieval marriages began with virtual strangers. A young woman might know very little about her husband's personality, his temperament, his kindness or cruelty, his intelligence or foolishness. She might know his family's reputation, his economic prospects, and his basic character as assessed by her parents, but the intimate details of who he was as a person would only be revealed after the wedding. This system worked better for some than others. Many medieval couples seem to have developed genuine affection and partnership over time, even if their marriages didn't begin with romantic love. The shared work of building a life together, raising children, and surviving the challenges of medieval life could create strong bonds between spouses who had started as strangers. But the system also created opportunities for misery. A young woman married to a cruel or violent man had very little recourse. A young man married to someone he found completely incompatible had few options for escape. Divorce was almost impossible for ordinary people, and even annulment required proving that the marriage had been invalid from the beginning, which was extremely difficult to do. The wealthy had somewhat more options, but they also faced greater pressures. A noble marriage that failed could have political consequences that extended far beyond the unhappy couple. Alliances could be broken, territories could be lost, and families could find themselves vulnerable to their enemies. This meant that noble couples were often under enormous pressure to make their marriages work, regardless of their personal feelings about each other. Women, regardless of their social class, had far fewer freedoms in courtship and marriage than men. A woman's reputation was fragile and precious, and any suggestion of impropriety could ruin her chances of making a good marriage. She was expected to be modest, chaste, and obedient, to defer to her parents' wishes in choosing a husband, and to accept whatever match they arranged for her. Even women who had some say in their choice of partners faced significant limitations. They couldn't travel freely to meet potential suitors. They couldn't initiate courtship or express their preferences too openly. They were dependent on their families to arrange introductions and negotiate the terms of their marriages. And once married, they were expected to submit to their husband's authority in all matters. Men had more freedom, but they too faced constraints. A man's choice of wife reflected on his judgment and his family's honor. He was expected to choose someone who would be a credit to his household, who would manage his domestic affairs competently, and who would bear him legitimate heirs. If he chose poorly, he might face criticism from his family and community, and he would have to live with the consequences of his choice for the rest of his life. The gap between the beautiful ideals of courtly love and the harsh realities of medieval courtship was enormous. The songs and poems that celebrated noble, selfless devotion were entertainment for a privileged few, while the vast majority of people had to navigate a system that prioritized practical considerations over romantic feelings. Yet even within these constraints, medieval people found ways to express affection and desire. They might not have had the freedom to choose their partners based on romantic love, but they could still hope for compatibility and mutual respect. They might not have been able to court openly, but they could still exchange glances at church, share brief conversations at market, and look forward to the possibility of genuine partnership in marriage. The letters and documents that survive from medieval times occasionally give us glimpses of real affection between married couples. A merchant's wife writing to her husband during his travels, expressing her longing for his return. A nobleman's will that speaks tenderly of his beloved wife and his hopes for her welfare after his death. These moments of genuine feeling shine through the formal language of medieval documents, reminding us that even within a system that didn't prioritize romantic love, people could still find ways to care deeply for each other. Understanding this tension between ideal and reality helps us appreciate the complexity of medieval emotional life. The people of this era weren't simply ignorant of romantic love or incapable of deep feeling. They were navigating a social system that had very different priorities and constraints than our own. Within those constraints, they found ways to build meaningful relationships, to express affection and desire, and to create partnerships that could sustain them through the challenges of medieval life. As we continue our exploration of medieval intimacy, we'll see how these constraints shaped not just courtship and marriage, but also the more hidden aspects of medieval sexual and romantic life. The gap between public expectations and private desires created spaces where people could explore connections that didn't fit within the official rules of their society. But first, we need to understand how those official rules worked and how deeply they influenced every aspect of medieval life. Chapter 2. Love among the peasants. The vast majority of medieval people lived lives that bore no resemblance to the elegant courtly romances we explored in our previous chapter. While troubadours sang of impossible loves and noble knights pined for unattainable ladies, the common people of medieval Europe were navigating love, desire, and intimacy within the harsh constraints of subsistence living. Their stories were not recorded in beautiful illuminated manuscripts or celebrated in song, but they were no less real, no less meaningful, and certainly no less complex than the romantic ideals of the noble courts. Picture a small village in 13th century England, perhaps 50 souls living in a cluster of humble dwellings scattered around a central green. The houses are simple structures, most consisting of a single room where entire families eat, sleep, work, and live out their intimate lives together. Privacy, as we understand it, simply does not exist. A young woman named Margot might share her family's single room with her parents, her younger siblings, perhaps an elderly grandparent, and during harsh winters, even some of the family's precious livestock brought inside for warmth. In this environment, the development of romantic feelings and the expression of physical desire required a completely different set of strategies than those available to the wealthy. There were no private chambers where lovers could meet in secret, no servants who could be trusted to carry messages between sweethearts, no elaborate gardens where couples could walk alone under the stars. Instead, young people had to find moments of connection within the rhythm of communal life, snatching brief opportunities for intimacy between the endless demands of survival. The working day for medieval peasants began before dawn and continued until well after sunset. There was no leisure time as we might understand it today, no weekends or vacations, no clear separation between work and personal life. Every daylight hour was precious, needed for the countless tasks that kept families alive through the harsh seasons. Fields had to be plowed, seeds planted, crops tended, animals fed, food preserved, clothes mended, tools repaired. Love had to find its place within this relentless schedule, or it would find no place at all. Yet within these constraints, young people did find ways to connect with each other. The communal nature of medieval village life, while it eliminated privacy, also created opportunities for interaction that might not have existed in a more individualistic society. Young men and women worked side by side during harvest time, their hands occasionally brushing as they gathered grain or loaded wagons. They walked together to and from the fields, sharing the burden of heavy tools and perhaps stealing moments of conversation along the way. The village well was a particularly important gathering place, one of the few locations where unmarried people could legitimately find themselves in close proximity. Water had to be drawn daily, and the task often fell to young women who would gather there in the early morning or evening twilight. A young man might find reasons to linger near the well, offering to help carry heavy buckets or to repair a broken rope. These brief encounters, conducted under the watchful eyes of the community, were often the foundation of medieval peasant courtship. Church attendance provided another opportunity for connection. The entire village would gather for Sunday Mass, and young people would have the chance to see each other dressed in their finest clothes, however humble those might be. They could exchange glances during the service, perhaps share a brief word of greeting as they filed out of the church, or walk together for a few moments as the community dispersed back to their individual homes. These interactions were carefully observed by parents and neighbors, who understood that even the smallest signs of mutual interest needed to be noted and evaluated. The seasonal celebrations that marked the agricultural year created rare opportunities for more relaxed social interaction. Harvest festivals, May Day celebrations, and the various religious holidays provided occasions when normal work routines were suspended, and the community could gather for food, drink, and entertainment. These were times when young people might find themselves dancing together, sharing a cup of ale, or simply sitting close enough to have a quiet conversation without the usual supervision. But even these moments of celebration were shadowed by the realities of peasant life. A young woman like Margot would know that her family's survival depended on her making a practical marriage, not a romantic one. She needed to find a husband who could provide adequate shelter, food, and protection for her and any children they might have. Her parents would be evaluating potential suitors, not based on their charm or attractiveness, but on their ability to work hard, their reputation for honesty and reliability, and their prospects for maintaining a stable household. The economics of peasant life meant that most young people could not afford to marry until they were in their 20s or even 30s. A young man needed to inherit his father's land or secure a tenancy from the local lord before he could support a wife. A young woman needed to accumulate a small dowry, perhaps a few coins, some household goods, or a skill that would make her valuable to a potential husband. This created long years of waiting, during which romantic feelings might develop and intensify, but could not be openly expressed or acted upon. During these extended courtships, physical intimacy had to be carefully managed. The church taught that any sexual contact outside of marriage was sinful, and the community enforced these teachings through constant surveillance and harsh punishment for transgressors. A young woman who became pregnant outside of marriage faced social disgrace, possible exile from the community, and the very real risk of death in childbirth without the support of a husband's family. Yet human nature being what it is, young people did find ways to express their desire for each other. The hayloft became a symbol of peasant romance, precisely because it was one of the few places where couples could hope to find even a few moments of privacy. During the busy harvest season, when the loft was filled with freshly cut hay, a young couple might steal away for a brief encounter, knowing that discovery would mean scandal and possibly the end of their hopes for marriage. The fields themselves, especially during the long twilight hours of summer, provided another refuge for lovers. A young man and woman might find excuses to work late in a distant field where they could speak freely without being overheard, perhaps share a brief embrace or a stolen kiss. But even these moments were fraught with danger. Someone might notice their absence, or they might be discovered by a neighbor who had wandered into the same field on legitimate business. The physical realities of peasant life shaped every aspect of romantic relationships. Most people had only one or two sets of clothes, and these were often rough, patched, and far from clean. Personal hygiene was limited by the scarcity of water and the lack of privacy for bathing. Young people courting each other had to navigate physical attraction under circumstances that were far from ideal, finding beauty and desire in faces marked by hard work and weather, in bodies shaped by constant labor and simple diets. The one-room family dwelling created unique challenges for newly married couples. A young bride might find herself sharing a bed with her new husband while his parents slept just a few feet away, separated only by a thin curtain or wooden partition. The development of physical intimacy had to occur within this constrained space, with the constant awareness that any sound might be heard by other family members. Privacy for lovemaking might be found only in the brief hours before dawn, when the rest of the household was still asleep, or during the rare occasions when other family members were away from home. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural life influenced even the most intimate aspects of marriage. Spring was a time of intense labor, when every daylight hour was needed for planting and preparation. Summer brought the exhausting work of tending crops and making hay. Autumn required the back-breaking effort of harvest and preservation. Winter, while it brought relief from field work, also brought the challenges of surviving on stored food and fuel, of keeping warm in inadequately heated dwellings, of maintaining health during the dark months when fresh food was scarce. Within these rhythms, couples had to find time for each other, for the physical and emotional intimacy that would sustain their relationship through the hardships of peasant life. A husband and wife might find their most private moments during the midday rest period, when the sun was too hot for field work and the family might scatter to find shade. They might steal time together during the evening hours, after the day's work was done, but before the household settled down for sleep. The bonds between peasant couples were often forged through shared labor and mutual dependence. A husband and wife worked as a team, each contributing essential skills to the household's survival. The wife might be responsible for the vegetable garden, the care of small animals like chickens and pigs, the preservation of food, and the production of clothing. The husband would handle the heavy field work, the maintenance of tools and buildings, and the management of larger livestock. Their success as a couple depended on their ability to coordinate these efforts effectively. This practical partnership could develop into deep emotional bonds, even when the marriage had begun as a purely practical arrangement. Couples who had weathered bad harvests together, who had nursed each other through illnesses, who had grieved together over the loss of children, often developed a profound intimacy that went far beyond mere physical attraction. Their love was expressed not in poetry or elaborate gestures, but in the daily acts of care and support that made survival possible. The high rates of infant and child mortality in medieval times meant that pregnancy and childbirth were central experiences in peasant marriage. A young wife might become pregnant soon after marriage, beginning a cycle of pregnancy, birth, nursing, and recovery that would continue throughout her fertile years. The physical demands of this cycle, combined with the hard work required for household survival, meant that couples had to find ways to maintain their connection through periods of exhaustion, illness, and loss. The community played a crucial role in supporting these relationships. Neighbors would help with childcare, share resources during times of hardship, and provide emotional support during times of crisis. The village as a whole had an interest in the stability of each household, because unstable families could become burdens on the community's limited resources. This created a system of informal social support that helped sustain marriages through difficult times. But the community also imposed strict limitations on acceptable behavior. A husband who was cruel to his wife might face informal sanctions from his neighbors, but a wife who was perceived as disobedient or unfaithful could face much harsher consequences. The balance of power within peasant marriages was heavily tilted toward the husband, who had legal authority over his wife and children, and who could rely on community support for maintaining that authority. Despite these constraints, medieval records suggest that many peasant women found ways to exercise influence within their marriages and households. A wife who was skilled at managing the household economy, who had good relationships with neighbors, or who came from a respected family, might have considerable informal power. She might be able to influence her husband's decisions, protect her children's interests, and maintain friendships and alliances that served the family's long-term welfare. The children of peasant families grew up witnessing these complex relationships between their parents. They learned about love and marriage, not from romantic stories, but from observing the daily interactions of adults who were trying to build sustainable lives together under difficult circumstances. They saw how couples could support each other through hardship, how they could find moments of tenderness and joy even in the midst of hard labor, and how they could create bonds that endured despite the absence of romantic courtship. Young people approaching marriage age understood that their choice of partner would determine the course of their entire lives. There would be no divorce, no second chances, no escape from a marriage that proved unhappy or unsuitable. This knowledge made the courtship process both more cautious and more intense. Young couples had to evaluate each other not just as potential lovers, but as lifelong partners in the challenging work of survival. The letters and documents that occasionally survive from medieval peasant communities give us glimpses of genuine affection between married couples. A husband's will that speaks tenderly of his wife and his concern for her welfare after his death. A wife's testimony in a legal proceeding that reveals her deep knowledge of her husband's character and motivations. These fragments suggest that even within the constraints of arranged marriages and economic necessity, many couples found ways to develop real emotional bonds. The physical aspects of peasant marriage were shaped by the same practical concerns that governed every other aspect of life. Couples had to find ways to maintain their physical relationship within the constraints of shared living spaces, limited privacy, and the constant demands of work and childcare. They had to navigate the challenges of pregnancy and childbirth without modern medical care, supporting each other through the fears and risks that accompanied every birth. The seasonal nature of agricultural work meant that couples might experience periods of intense togetherness, alternating with times of separation. During harvest season, everyone worked together in the fields, but at other times, husbands might travel to distant markets or take temporary work elsewhere, leaving wives to manage the household alone. These separations tested the bonds between couples, requiring them to maintain their connection across distance and time. The religious calendar also influenced the rhythm of peasant relationships. The church designated certain periods as times of fasting and penance, when married couples were expected to abstain from sexual relations. These periods of abstinence were meant to encourage spiritual reflection and self-discipline, but they also created cycles of separation and reunion that may have intensified the emotional bonds between spouses. As we consider the lives of medieval peasants, we begin to understand how different their experience of love and intimacy was from both the courtly ideals of the nobility and our own modern expectations. Their relationships were shaped by scarcity, uncertainty, and the constant pressure of survival. Yet within these constraints, they found ways to create meaningful connections, to express affection and desire, and to build partnerships that could sustain them through the challenges of their harsh world. The love stories of medieval peasants were not recorded in beautiful manuscripts or celebrated in song, but they were no less real for being unrecorded. They were written in the daily acts of care and support that made survival possible, in the children who carried their parents' hopes for the future, and in the communities that grew and endured through generations of shared hardship and mutual aid. Understanding these hidden stories helps us appreciate the complexity of medieval emotional life and the ways that people have always found to connect with each other, even under the most difficult circumstances. Chapter 3: Virginity, Honor, and Surveillance. In the quiet hours before dawn in medieval Europe, when the world was still wrapped in darkness and most souls lay sleeping, there lived concerns that consumed the waking thoughts of families, communities, and the church itself. These were not concerns about war or famine, though those certainly troubled medieval minds, but rather an obsession with something far more intimate and personal: the question of female purity and the elaborate systems of surveillance that communities developed to guard and verify it. The concept of virginity in medieval society carried weight that modern minds can barely comprehend. It was not simply a personal matter or even a religious concern, but rather the foundation upon which entire social and economic structures were built. A young woman's virginity was considered her most precious possession, more valuable than gold or land, because it represented not just her own moral worth, but the honor of her entire family, the validity of future marriage negotiations, and even the legitimacy of children who might be born from her union. To understand how deeply this obsession penetrated medieval life, we must first recognize that virginity was not merely a physical state, but a complex social construct that encompassed notions of purity, obedience, and moral worth. The Church taught that virginity was a reflection of spiritual purity, a state that brought humans closer to the divine. The Virgin Mary served as the ultimate example of feminine perfection, a woman who had achieved motherhood while retaining her virginal purity, an impossible standard that nonetheless shaped expectations for all women. But the religious significance of virginity was intertwined with very practical economic and social considerations. In a world where marriage was primarily a business arrangement designed to transfer property and consolidate family alliances, A bride's virginity served as a guarantee of the legitimacy of any children born from the union. A man who married a virgin could be confident that any children his wife bore would be his own, ensuring that his property would pass to his legitimate heirs rather than to the offspring of another man. This concern with legitimacy was not merely a matter of personal pride or jealousy, but a fundamental requirement for the stability of the entire social system. Property ownership, inheritance rights, and social status all depended on the ability to trace legitimate bloodlines. A woman who was not a virgin at marriage introduced uncertainty into this system, raising questions about the paternity of future children and threatening the orderly transfer of wealth and power from one generation to the next. The economic implications of virginity were most clearly visible in the practice of dowry negotiations. When families arranged marriages for their daughters, the bride's virginity was one of the most important assets being transferred. A virgin bride commanded a higher bride price or could negotiate a more favorable marriage contract because she represented a better investment for the groom's family. Her purity was a form of currency, something that could be traded for economic advantage and social advancement. The documentation that survives from medieval marriage negotiations reveals the explicit ways that virginity was valued and verified. Marriage contracts often included specific clauses about the bride's virginal state, sometimes with financial penalties if she was later discovered to be impure. Wealthy families might hire physicians to examine prospective brides, looking for physical signs of virginity that were believed to be reliable indicators of sexual experience. These examinations were based on medical theories that we now know to be completely false, but they were accepted as scientific fact in medieval times. Physicians believed that they could determine a woman's virginal status by examining her hymen, her gait, the appearance of her eyes, and even the sound of her voice. These examinations were humiliating and invasive, but they were considered necessary precautions in high-stakes marriage negotiations. The obsession with female virginity created an elaborate system of surveillance that extended far beyond the immediate family. In medieval communities, everyone had a stake in monitoring the behavior of unmarried women because the reputation of individual women reflected on the moral character of the entire community. A village with a reputation for loose morals might find it difficult to arrange good marriages for its daughters, affecting the economic prospects of all its families. This community surveillance operated through both formal and informal mechanisms. The church provided formal oversight through regular confession, where priests would question young women about their thoughts, desires, and behaviors. Parish priests were expected to know the moral status of every member of their congregation, and they would share concerns about particular individuals with parents and community leaders. But the informal surveillance was even more pervasive and effective. In small medieval communities, privacy was virtually impossible to maintain. Neighbors knew when visitors came and went, when couples spent time alone together, when young women strayed from their usual routines. The medieval equivalent of social media was the network of gossip that connected every household in the community, carrying news about suspicious behavior from one end of the village to the other. Women were particularly active in this surveillance network, perhaps because they understood better than men how easily a reputation could be destroyed. Older women took it upon themselves to monitor the behavior of younger ones, watching for signs of inappropriate relationships, improper dress, or suspicious absences. They might position themselves at windows or doorways where they could observe the comings and goings of their neighbors, or they might find excuses to visit households where they suspected improper behavior was occurring. The consequences of being caught in compromising circumstances were severe, particularly for women. A young woman who was discovered alone with a man, even in innocent circumstances, might find her reputation permanently damaged. The community might begin to whisper about her character. Potential suitors might lose interest in marrying her, and her family might struggle to negotiate a respectable marriage contract on her behalf. These social consequences created a climate of fear that shaped every aspect of young women's lives. They learned to be constantly vigilant about their behavior, their associations, and even their appearance. They understood that a single moment of carelessness could destroy their future prospects, condemning them to a life of social marginalization and economic insecurity. The fear of damaged reputations also created opportunities for manipulation and blackmail. Someone who possessed knowledge of a young woman's indiscretions might use that information to extort money from her family or to force her into an unwanted marriage. The mere accusation of improper behavior could be devastating, even if it was completely false, because the community's trust, once lost, was nearly impossible to regain. The mythology surrounding chastity belts provides a fascinating window into medieval anxieties about female sexuality. While popular culture has embraced the image of the chastity belt as a symbol of medieval oppression, the historical reality is more complex and perhaps more interesting. The elaborate metal devices that appear in museums and popular depictions were largely Victorian inventions created by 19th century collectors and exhibitors who were projecting their own anxieties about sexuality onto the medieval past. The few authentic medieval references to chastity belts suggest that they were extremely rare and were used primarily in very specific circumstances, such as when a merchant or crusader had to travel for extended periods and wanted to ensure his wife's fidelity in his absence. Even then, the practical difficulties of maintaining hygiene and health while wearing such a device would have made long-term use virtually impossible. The real mechanisms of controlling female sexuality in medieval times were far more subtle and effective than mechanical devices. They operated through internalized shame, community surveillance, and the constant threat of social and economic consequences. Young women learned to monitor their own behavior, to avoid situations that might be misinterpreted, and to accept that their value as human beings was intimately connected to their sexual purity. The Church reinforced these social pressures through its teachings about the nature of female sexuality. Medieval theologians taught that women were naturally more susceptible to sexual temptation than men, that their weaker moral nature made them more likely to succumb to carnal desires. This belief justified the elaborate systems of control and surveillance that surrounded unmarried women, framing them as necessary protections against feminine weakness rather than as oppressive restrictions on personal freedom. The doctrine of original sin played a crucial role in shaping medieval attitudes toward female sexuality. According to church teaching, Eve's disobedience in the Garden of Eden had brought sin and death into the world, and all women carried the burden of this original transgression. Sexual desire was seen as a consequence of the fall, a reminder of humanity's separation from divine grace. For women, who were considered the source of this temptation, sexual purity became a way of atoning for Eve's sin and demonstrating their worthiness for salvation. This theological framework created a complex relationship between sexuality and spirituality that profoundly influenced medieval women's understanding of their own bodies and desires. Physical pleasure was associated with spiritual corruption, while sexual abstinence was seen as a pathway to holiness. Young women who successfully maintained their virginity until marriage were celebrated not just for their practical value as brides, but for their spiritual achievement in resisting temptation. The emphasis on female virginity also created different standards for men and women when it came to premarital sexual behavior. While men were certainly expected to control their desires and avoid sexual sin, their sexual experience was not considered as damaging to their character or as threatening to their future prospects. A man who had sexual relationships before marriage might be required to do penance, but he would not necessarily be considered unsuitable for marriage or permanently damaged by his experiences. This double standard was justified by medieval theories about the nature of male and female sexuality. Men were believed to have stronger sexual drives that were more difficult to control, making their lapses more understandable and forgivable. Women, on the other hand, were expected to have weaker sexual desires that they should be able to control through proper moral training and religious devotion. A woman who engaged in premarital sex was therefore seen as having failed in her fundamental duty to maintain moral purity. The practical implementation of these ideals varied significantly across different social classes and regions. Wealthy families had more resources to invest in protecting their daughters' reputations, providing them with private tutors, chaperones, and carefully controlled social environments. They could afford to keep their daughters secluded until marriage, limiting their interactions with potential suitors to formal supervised encounters. Poor families, however, faced more complex challenges. Their daughters needed to work to contribute to the family's economic survival, which inevitably brought them into contact with men in less controlled circumstances. A peasant girl might work in the fields alongside male laborers, serve in taverns where she would encounter traveling merchants and craftsmen, or take employment as a domestic servant in households where she would be vulnerable to unwanted advances from her employers. These economic realities created a class-based hierarchy of sexual morality, where wealthy women were expected to maintain higher standards of purity than their poorer counterparts. The reputation of a merchant's daughter was considered more important than that of a peasant girl, not because of any inherent moral difference, but because the economic stakes were higher for families with more property and social status to protect. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life also influenced the surveillance of female sexuality. During harvest time, when entire communities worked together in the fields, there were more opportunities for unsupervised interactions between young men and women. Families and community leaders were particularly vigilant during these periods, watching for signs of inappropriate behavior that might develop under the cover of communal work. Religious festivals and celebrations presented similar challenges to the maintenance of female purity. These occasions brought together people from different villages and social classes, creating opportunities for interactions that might not be possible during the routine of daily life. The combination of celebration, alcohol, and relaxed supervision could lead to behaviors that would be quickly noticed and condemned by the community. The wedding night itself became a focal point for the verification of female virginity. In many medieval communities, the marriage bed would be examined the morning after the wedding for evidence of the bride's virginal blood. The stained sheets might be displayed to family members or community leaders as proof that the marriage had been properly consummated and that the bride had indeed been pure. These examinations were based on the mistaken belief that all virgin women would bleed during their first sexual encounter, a medical fallacy that caused enormous anxiety and suffering. Women who did not bleed for any number of perfectly normal reasons might find themselves accused of deception, facing annulment of their marriage, return of their dowry, and permanent damage to their reputation. The psychological impact of these practices on medieval women can hardly be overstated. Young girls grew up knowing that their entire future depended on maintaining their physical purity, that a single mistake could destroy their prospects for marriage, economic security, and social acceptance. They learned to fear their own bodies and desires, to see their sexuality as a dangerous force that needed to be constantly controlled and suppressed. The letters and documents that survive from medieval times occasionally give us glimpses of the real women who lived within these constraints. We find records of young women who fled their families rather than submit to unwanted marriages, of wives who were abandoned by their husbands after failing to provide the expected proof of virginity, of communities that rallied to protect the reputation of a woman who had been falsely accused of improper behavior. These fragments of human experience remind us that medieval women were not simply passive victims of an oppressive system, but active agents who found ways to navigate and sometimes resist the constraints placed upon them. They developed strategies for protecting their reputations while still maintaining social connections, for expressing their desires within acceptable boundaries, and for supporting each other through the challenges of living under constant surveillance. The obsession with female virginity in medieval society was not simply a matter of religious doctrine or social tradition, but a complex system that served multiple functions in maintaining social order and economic stability. It provided a mechanism for controlling inheritance and property transfer, for maintaining family honor and social status, and for regulating sexual behavior in communities that lacked other forms of social control. Understanding this system helps us appreciate the enormous challenges that medieval women faced in navigating their personal relationships and intimate lives. Every decision they made about their bodies, their relationships, and their desires had to be weighed against the potential consequences for their families, their communities, and their own futures. The price of female sexuality in medieval times was measured not just in personal happiness, but in social survival itself. Chapter 4. Lust, Sin, and the Church in the shadowed corners of medieval stone churches, where candlelight flickered against cold walls and the scent of incense hung heavy in the air. There existed a complex and often contradictory relationship between human desire and divine doctrine. The church, which dominated every aspect of medieval life, held views on sexuality that were far more intricate and controlling than many modern people realize. To understand how medieval people experienced intimacy and desire, we must first explore the elaborate theological framework that shaped their understanding of their own bodies, their relationships, and their deepest longings. The Church's teaching on sexuality was rooted in the writings of early Christian theologians, particularly St. Augustine, who had developed a complex theology around the nature of sexual desire and its place in the fallen world. Augustine taught that sexual desire itself was a consequence of original sin, a reminder of humanity's separation from divine grace. According to this doctrine, even the most natural human impulses toward physical intimacy were tainted by the corruption that had entered the world through Adam and Eve's disobedience in the Garden of Eden. This theological foundation created a profound ambivalence towards sexuality that permeated medieval Christian thought. On one hand, the Church recognized that sexual reproduction was necessary for the continuation of the human race and had been blessed by God in the commandment to be fruitful and multiply. On the other hand, the physical pleasure associated with sexual activity was viewed with deep suspicion, seen as a dangerous temptation that could lead souls away from their proper focus on spiritual matters. The result was a complex set of rules and regulations that governed not just when and with whom medieval people could engage in sexual activity, but also how they should think and feel about their own desires. These rules extended far beyond the simple prohibition against sex outside of marriage, reaching into the most intimate aspects of married life and creating elaborate systems of penance and punishment for those who transgressed against the Church's teachings. Within marriage itself, the Church imposed strict limitations on sexual activity that would seem almost incomprehensible to modern couples. Sexual intercourse was considered acceptable only for the purpose of procreation, and couples were expected to approach even marital intimacy with restraint and spiritual discipline. The Church taught that sexual pleasure, even between husband and wife, was a necessary evil that should be minimized and carefully controlled. Medieval penitential manuals, the guidebooks that priests used to determine appropriate punishments for various sins, contain detailed instructions about the proper conduct of married couples. These manuals specified not only when sexual activity was prohibited, but also which sexual positions were acceptable, what thoughts and feelings were appropriate during intimacy, and how couples should prepare spiritually for physical union. The level of detail in these instructions reveals the extent to which the Church sought to regulate even the most private aspects of human experience. The Church designated numerous times throughout the year when even married couples were expected to abstain from sexual relations. These included the 40 days of Lent, the period of Advent before Christmas, the weeks following Easter, and the days surrounding major religious festivals. Additionally, couples were expected to abstain during the wife's menstrual period, during pregnancy, and while she was nursing a child. When these various restrictions were combined, they created a calendar in which sexual activity was forbidden for a significant portion of the year. The reasoning behind these restrictions was both theological and practical. The Church taught that sexual abstinence was a form of spiritual discipline that helped believers focus their attention on divine rather than earthly matters. By temporarily giving up physical pleasure, couples could demonstrate their commitment to spiritual growth and their recognition that their highest loyalty belonged to God rather than to their own desires. The confession system provided the Church with an unprecedented level of insight into the private lives of medieval people. Every Christian was required to confess their sins to a priest at least once a year, and many confessed more frequently. During these confessions, penitents were expected to reveal not just their actions, but also their thoughts, desires, and fantasies. The priest would ask detailed questions about the penitent's sexual behavior, often using standardized lists of questions that covered every conceivable form of sexual expression. The surviving confessional manuals reveal the extraordinary range of sexual behaviors that the Church considered sinful. These included not just obvious transgressions like adultery and fornication, but also more subtle violations like experiencing excessive pleasure during marital intercourse, thinking lustful thoughts about one's own spouse, or engaging in sexual activity at forbidden times. Even the failure to desire sexual intercourse with one's spouse could be considered a form of sin, as it might indicate a lack of commitment to the duty of procreation. The penance assigned for sexual sins varied according to the severity of the transgression and the social status of the sinner. A peasant who confessed to lustful thoughts might be required to fast for a few days or to recite a specific number of prayers. A nobleman who committed adultery might face years of public penance, including exclusion from communion, pilgrimage to distant shrines, or substantial donations to the church. The most serious sexual sins could result in excommunication, effectively cutting the sinner off from the Christian community and condemning them to eternal damnation unless they performed extraordinary acts of contrition. The public nature of many penances meant that sexual sins often became community knowledge, even when the original transgression had been private. A person who was seen performing public penance would be recognized as having committed some form of serious sin, and the community would speculate about the nature of their transgression. This created an additional layer of social control, as the fear of public shame could be even more powerful than the fear of spiritual punishment. The Church's regulation of sexuality extended beyond individual behavior to encompass the broader social order. Priests were expected to monitor the sexual behavior of their parishioners, watching for signs of illicit relationships, inappropriate desires, or violations of the Church's rules about marital conduct. They were encouraged to question community members about their neighbors' behavior, creating a network of surveillance that made privacy virtually impossible. The celibacy required of priests and monks created its own complex dynamics around sexuality and desire. These men, who had taken vows to renounce sexual activity entirely, were paradoxically the ones responsible for regulating the sexual behavior of the lay population. Their theoretical distance from sexual experience was supposed to give them the objectivity and spiritual authority necessary to guide others, but in practice, it often created tensions and contradictions that complicated their pastoral duties. The enforcement of clerical celibacy was itself a source of ongoing concern for the church hierarchy. Many priests struggled with their vows of chastity, and church records reveal numerous cases of clergy who engaged in sexual relationships despite their religious commitments. These violations were seen as particularly serious because they represented a betrayal of sacred vows and threatened the spiritual authority of the church itself. The presence of sexually active priests in medieval communities created complex dynamics around the regulation of lay sexuality. A priest who was himself struggling with sexual desire might be particularly harsh in his judgment of others' transgressions, perhaps as a way of demonstrating his own commitment to church doctrine. Alternatively, a priest who was secretly violating his own vows might be more lenient with his parishioners, understanding from personal experience the difficulty of controlling sexual desire. The Church's teachings on sexuality were not uniform across all regions or time periods. Different theological schools emphasized different aspects of sexual morality, and local customs often influenced how church doctrine was interpreted and enforced. In some areas, the church was more tolerant of certain forms of sexual expression, while in others, the enforcement of sexual morality was particularly strict and punitive. The rise of scholastic theology in the later medieval period brought new sophistication to the church's understanding of sexuality. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas developed elaborate theoretical frameworks for understanding the relationship between reason, desire, and moral behavior. These intellectual developments influenced the way that sexual sins were categorized and punished, creating more nuanced approaches to sexual morality that took into account factors like intention, circumstance, and the moral development of the individual. The Church's influence on medieval sexuality extended beyond formal religious doctrine to encompass popular culture and folk beliefs. Religious stories and legends often featured themes of sexual temptation and moral triumph, providing models for how ordinary people should understand and manage their own desires. The lives of saints offered examples of individuals who had successfully overcome sexual temptation, while cautionary tales warned of the spiritual dangers that awaited those who succumbed to carnal desires. The cult of the Virgin Mary provided a particularly important model for medieval women's understanding of sexuality. Mary's perpetual virginity, combined with her role as mother of Jesus, created an ideal of feminine purity that was both inspiring and impossible to achieve. Medieval women were encouraged to emulate Mary's chastity and devotion, even as they were expected to fulfill their roles as wives and mothers. This created a fundamental tension in medieval women's spiritual lives, as they struggled to reconcile their physical roles with their spiritual aspirations. The Church's teachings on sexuality also influenced medieval medicine and natural philosophy. Physicians and scholars developed theories about the nature of sexual desire that were heavily influenced by religious doctrine. They understood sexual activity as a potentially dangerous force that needed to be carefully controlled and channeled, and they developed elaborate systems of classification for different types of sexual behavior and their associated risks. The medical understanding of sexuality in medieval times was intertwined with religious concepts of sin and purity. Physicians believed that excessive sexual activity could lead to physical illness, while sexual abstinence was thought to promote both physical and spiritual health. This medical framework reinforced the Church's teachings about the dangers of uncontrolled desire and provided additional justification for the elaborate systems of sexual regulation that the Church had developed. The intersection of religious and medical authority in matters of sexuality created powerful tools for social control. When both priests and physicians agreed that certain forms of sexual behavior were dangerous, it became much more difficult for individuals to resist or question these teachings. The combination of spiritual and physical threats provided compelling reasons for compliance with Church doctrine, even when that compliance required significant personal sacrifice. The Church's regulation of sexuality also extended to the realm of thought and fantasy. Medieval theologians developed elaborate classifications of mental sins, including various forms of lustful thinking that were considered transgressive, even when they were not acted upon. The mere experience of sexual desire, even within marriage, could be considered sinful if it was excessive or if it distracted the individual from their spiritual duties. This focus on the regulation of thought and desire created a culture of intense self-surveillance, where individuals were expected to monitor their own mental states constantly and to confess any inappropriate thoughts or feelings. The result was a level of psychological control that extended far beyond external behavior to encompass the most private aspects of mental and emotional life. The Church's teachings on sexuality were reinforced through a variety of cultural mechanisms, including art, literature, and popular entertainment. Religious imagery often contrasted the dangers of sexual temptation with the rewards of spiritual purity, providing visual representations of the church's teachings that could be understood even by those who could not read. Mystery plays and religious dramas frequently featured themes of sexual temptation and moral redemption, bringing church doctrine to life through popular entertainment. The architectural environment of medieval churches also reinforced messages about sexuality and desire. The stark stone walls, the emphasis on vertical lines drawing the eye upward toward heaven, and the carefully controlled lighting all created an atmosphere that discouraged earthly thoughts and encouraged spiritual reflection. The physical space of the church served as a constant reminder of the spiritual values that were supposed to govern all aspects of life, including sexuality. The church's influence on medieval sexuality was not limited to explicit teachings and formal regulations. The broader Christian worldview that shaped medieval culture emphasized the temporary nature of earthly life and the importance of preparing for eternal salvation. This perspective encouraged people to view their physical desires and relationships as less important than their spiritual development, creating a cultural context in which sexual abstinence and self-denial were valued above physical pleasure and satisfaction. The complex relationship between church doctrine and human nature created ongoing tensions in medieval society. While the church's teachings provided a framework for understanding and regulating sexuality, they also created impossible standards that few people could fully meet. The result was a culture in which sexual guilt and anxiety were common experiences, even among those who were trying their best to live according to church teachings. The records of medieval church courts reveal the extent to which ordinary people struggled with the church's sexual morality. These courts handled cases involving adultery, fornication, and other sexual transgressions, and their records provide glimpses into the real experiences of medieval people who were trying to navigate the complex relationship between their desires and their religious obligations. The sheer volume of these cases suggests that sexual transgression was common despite the severe punishments that the church imposed. The church's approach to sexuality also reflected broader concerns about social order and hierarchy. Sexual morality was understood to be connected to other forms of social behavior, and the regulation of sexuality was seen as essential to maintaining the stability of medieval society. The church taught that sexual disorder would lead to social chaos, and that the control of desire was therefore necessary for the preservation of civilization itself. As we consider the church's role in regulating medieval sexuality, we begin to understand how profoundly religious doctrine shaped the most intimate aspects of human experience. The elaborate systems of confession, penance, and punishment that the church developed created a culture in which sexuality was understood primarily as a spiritual problem rather than a natural human experience. This perspective influenced not only how medieval people behaved, but also how they understood themselves, their relationships, and their place in the cosmic order. Chapter 5. Forbidden love and secret trysts in the hushed twilight hours of medieval Europe, when the last bells of Vespers had faded into the evening mist, a different kind of story began to unfold. While the great halls grew quiet and the servants retreated to their quarters, shadows moved through moonlit gardens and figures slipped through partially opened windows. These were the hours when forbidden love found its voice, when hearts that dared not speak during the bright clarity of day finally whispered their secrets to the darkness. The medieval world with all its rigid structures and carefully maintained social boundaries, could not entirely suppress the human heart. Despite the watchful eyes of chaperones, the stern warnings of clergy, and the iron grip of family honor, love found a way to bloom in the most unlikely places, like wild flowers growing between the stones of a castle wall. These secret romances took root in the cracks of society's foundation, fragile yet persistent, beautiful yet dangerous. Picture, if you will, a young noble woman in her father's castle, her days filled with the endless repetition of prayer, needlework, and the careful study of household management. Her life was mapped out before her like a tapestry already half woven, each thread representing a duty, an obligation, a role she was born to fulfill. Yet in the quiet moments between her prescribed activities, her eyes would drift to the castle's gardens, where a young knight practiced his sword work in the early morning light. His movements were graceful, almost like a dance, and she found herself lingering at her window longer than propriety would suggest, watching the way the sunrise caught the golden threads in his hair. The gardens of medieval castles and manor houses became the stage for countless secret meetings, their winding paths and hidden alcoves providing the perfect backdrop for clandestine encounters. These spaces, carefully cultivated to represent paradise on earth, took on a deeper symbolism for lovers seeking stolen moments together. The enclosed garden, or hortus conclusus, was already heavy with meaning in medieval culture, representing the purity of the Virgin Mary and the promise of spiritual renewal. Yet for those who dared to meet in secret, these same gardens became earthly paradises of a different sort, places where the soul could find respite from the constraints of society. In the soft light of early morning, before the household stirred to life, you might have glimpsed a figure moving quietly through the herb garden, her soft slippers making no sound on the dew-dampened earth. She moved with purpose, yet cautiously, pausing often to listen for any sign that she had been discovered. The rosemary brushed against her skirts, releasing its fragrant oils into the cool air, while the lavender stood in neat rows like purple sentinels, guarding her secret. At the garden's heart, where a small fountain bubbled quietly to itself, another shadow waited, and when they met, their whispered words mingled with the gentle sound of falling water. These garden meetings required careful orchestration, for the medieval household was a place of constant activity and watchful eyes. Servants rose before dawn to begin their daily tasks, and the rhythms of castle life left few moments unobserved. Yet lovers found ways to communicate their intentions, developing elaborate systems of signals and messages that would have impressed the most skilled courtly diplomats. A flower left on a windowsill might indicate a willingness to meet, while its absence could signal danger or delay. The positioning of certain objects, the timing of appearances in common areas, even the selection of particular garments could all carry meaning for those who knew how to read the signs. The language of flowers became particularly important in these secret communications. In an age where literacy was limited and direct communication dangerous, the medieval lovers developed an intricate vocabulary of botanical symbols. A single red rose might speak of passionate love, while a white rose could indicate the purity of intention, despite the impropriety of the meeting. Forget-me-nots carried obvious meaning, while the humble daisy might represent the innocence that lovers hoped to maintain, even in their secret world. Herbs, too, carried messages, with rosemary for remembrance, thyme for courage, and sweet marjoram for the joy that love brought to otherwise constrained lives. The windows of medieval buildings, with their deep stone embrasures and heavy shutters, became another pathway for forbidden romance. These architectural features, designed primarily for defense and weather protection, took on new significance in the hands of creative lovers. The thickness of castle walls meant that windows were like small rooms unto themselves, with built-in seats where one might sit and gaze out at the world beyond. For those conducting secret affairs, these window alcoves became private meeting spaces, hidden from the main rooms yet accessible to those who knew the castle's layout intimately. Imagine the delicate process of arranging such a meeting. The lady of the castle might find herself drawn to her solar's great window during the afternoon hours, ostensibly to take advantage of the natural light for her embroidery. Yet her true attention was focused on the courtyard below, where she hoped to catch a glimpse of the one who had captured her heart. A subtle gesture, perhaps the adjustment of a curtain or the placement of a small object on the windowsill, might signal her presence to a watching lover. In return, he might position himself where she could see him, perhaps pausing in his duties to look up at her window, their eyes meeting across the space that separated them like a bridge built of longing. The most daring lovers might arrange for window meetings under cover of darkness when the castle settled into its nighttime quiet. The beloved might climb the rough stone walls, using the irregular blocks and decorative elements as handholds, risking life and limb for the chance of a whispered conversation. The lady would wait at her window, her heart beating so loudly she feared it might wake the entire household, listening for the soft scrape of leather against stone that would announce his arrival. When he finally appeared, silhouetted against the star-filled sky, their whispered words would carry all the weight of their impossible situation, every sentence precious because it might be their last. These window meetings required not only courage, but also intimate knowledge of the castle's rhythms and inhabitants. The lovers had to know when the guards would walk their rounds, when the servants would be occupied with their duties, and when the family members would be safely asleep. They had to understand the patterns of light and shadow, the way sounds carried through the stone corridors, and the subtle signs that might indicate they were being watched. This knowledge could only come from living within the castle's walls, from being part of its daily life, which made these affairs all the more dangerous, because discovery would mean betraying not just social conventions, but the trust of those who had welcomed them into their home. The risks involved in these secret meetings were considerable, extending far beyond the immediate physical danger of climbing walls or sneaking through darkened corridors. Medieval society was built on a foundation of reputation and honor, concepts that were particularly fragile when it came to matters of love and sexuality. For a woman, even the suspicion of impropriety could destroy her prospects for marriage and cast a shadow over her entire family's standing. For a man, being caught in a compromising position with a woman of higher social standing could mean not only personal ruin, but physical punishment or even death. Yet despite these dangers, the human heart proved remarkably resilient and creative in finding ways to express itself. The very constraints that made love difficult also made it more precious, more intense, more worthy of risk. In a world where marriages were arranged for political and economic advantage, where personal preference was considered a luxury few could afford, the opportunity to choose one's own beloved, even in secret, represented a form of freedom that was worth almost any price. The servants' quarters and working areas of medieval households became unexpected venues for romantic encounters, as the complex social hierarchy of the time created numerous opportunities for forbidden attractions. Kitchen maids might find themselves drawn to the handsome young men who served at the lord's table, while stable boys could hardly help but notice the graceful movements of the ladies who occasionally visited the horses. These relationships crossed not only social boundaries, but also the practical divisions of daily life, bringing together people whose paths might otherwise rarely intersect. In the great kitchens of medieval castles, where servants worked long hours in the warm glow of cooking fires, relationships developed slowly and carefully. The head cook, usually a person of some authority within the household hierarchy, might find himself smitten with a lady's maid who occasionally came to arrange special meals for her mistress. Their conversations would begin with practical matters, discussions of menus and dietary requirements, but gradually evolve into something more personal. The kitchen, with its constant activity and multiple entrances, provided both opportunity and cover for these developing relationships, as the bustle of meal preparation could mask whispered conversations and meaningful glances. The stables represented another world within the medieval household, a place where different rules seemed to apply. Here, the emphasis was on practical skill and the care of valuable animals rather than the fine points of courtly behavior. A young knight might find himself genuinely impressed by the knowledge and expertise of a stable master's daughter who could calm a fractious horse with a gentle touch and knew more about the care of these precious animals than many of the nobility who rode them. In the warm, hay-scented darkness of the stables, conversations could flow more freely, and the shared love of horses could provide a common ground that transcended social differences. The chapel, paradoxically, became another setting for forbidden romance, despite being the most sacred space in the medieval household. The regular cycle of religious services meant that all members of the household gathered there multiple times each day, providing natural opportunities for lovers to see each other without arousing suspicion. The formal nature of religious worship also provided cover for meaningful glances and subtle signals, as the requirement to maintain proper reverence made it difficult for observers to distinguish between spiritual devotion and earthly attraction. During the long hours of religious services, when the household gathered in the chapel for morning prayers, evening vespers, or special feast day celebrations, lovers could steal glances across the nave, their eyes meeting over the heads of the congregation. The rhythmic chanting of prayers and the flickering light of candles created an almost hypnotic atmosphere that seemed to intensify every emotion. A slight nod, a barely perceptible smile, or the deliberate positioning of hands during prayer could carry messages between lovers who dared not speak aloud. The most daring couples might arrange to meet in the chapel during the quiet hours between services, when the space was empty except for the ever-burning sanctuary lamp. The stone walls and vaulted ceilings that made the chapel such a powerful spiritual space also provided excellent acoustics for whispered conversations, though this same quality made it risky for secret meetings. Every word would echo softly through the space, and the approach of footsteps could be heard long before their owner appeared. Yet the sacred nature of the space provided a kind of protection, as few would suspect that anyone would dare to conduct a romantic affair in such a holy place. The risks associated with these chapel meetings were particularly severe, as they added the sin of sacrilege to the already dangerous transgression of forbidden love. Medieval society took the sanctity of religious spaces very seriously, and using a chapel for romantic purposes would be seen as a grave offense against God, as well as against social propriety. The punishments for such behavior could include not only physical punishment and social exile, but also spiritual penance that might last for years. Knights and ladies of the court faced unique challenges in their secret affairs, as their high social standing made them the subject of constant observation and gossip. Every aspect of their behavior was scrutinized for signs of impropriety, and their movements were tracked by servants, peers, and family members who all had reasons to be interested in their activities. Yet this same high position also provided certain advantages, as nobles had more freedom of movement within the castle and manor grounds, and their education often included skills that could be useful in conducting secret affairs. A knight who wished to court a lady in secret had to be particularly creative in his approach, as his military training and social position made him a highly visible figure in the household. He might arrange to encounter her during her daily walks in the garden, timing his own exercise routines to coincide with her movements. The practice of arms, a necessary part of any knight's daily routine, could provide cover for these meetings, as it was natural for him to be in the courtyard or training grounds at regular intervals. If he was skilled enough, he might even arrange for his practice sessions to become a kind of performance, displaying his prowess for the lady's appreciation while maintaining the pretense that he was simply fulfilling his knightly duties. The lady, for her part, had to be equally creative in finding opportunities to see her beloved knight. Her daily routine of religious observance, household management, and ladylike pursuits provided a framework within which she could operate, but every deviation from expected behavior risked drawing unwanted attention. She might develop a sudden interest in the castle's herb garden, claiming that she wished to learn more about medicinal plants, while actually hoping to encounter her knight during his morning exercises. Or she might volunteer to oversee certain household tasks that would take her to parts of the castle where she might glimpse him going about his duties. The development of courtly love literature during the medieval period both reflected and influenced the reality of secret affairs among the nobility. The elaborate codes of behavior described in romantic poetry and stories provided a kind of script that real lovers could follow, giving them a vocabulary for expressing their feelings and a framework for conducting their relationships. The concept of the knight who served his lady with absolute devotion, asking for nothing in return except the privilege of loving her from afar, became a model that many real couples attempted to follow, even as they struggled with the very human desires that such platonic ideals could not entirely satisfy. The exchange of tokens became an important part of these secret courtships, as lovers sought ways to maintain their connection even when they could not meet in person. A lady might embroider a small piece of cloth with her initials or a meaningful symbol, passing it to her knight through an intermediary or leaving it where he would find it. He might reciprocate with a flower from the garden where they had met, or a small piece of jewelry that he had commissioned from a traveling craftsman. These tokens served not only as romantic gestures, but also as tangible proof of the relationship's existence, dangerous evidence that lovers usually kept hidden, but treasured nonetheless. The involvement of servants in these secret affairs added another layer of complexity and risk to medieval romance. Servants were often the only people who had the freedom of movement and the intimate knowledge of household routines necessary to facilitate secret meetings. A loyal maid might carry messages between lovers, or a trusted groom might arrange for horses to be saddled for clandestine rides. Yet this dependence on servants also created vulnerabilities, as these helpers had their own interests to consider and might be tempted to betray their employer's secrets if offered sufficient inducement. The relationship between a noble and a servant represented one of the most dangerous forms of forbidden love in medieval society. The social gulf between them was so vast that even the suggestion of romantic involvement could destroy both participants. For the noble, such a relationship represented a betrayal of their social position and family honor that could result in disinheritance and exile. For the servant, it could mean death, as they would be seen as having violated the trust placed in them and having reached far above their proper station. Yet these relationships did occur, perhaps precisely because they were so forbidden. The daily contact between nobles and their personal servants created opportunities for relationships to develop slowly and naturally. A lady's maid who helped her mistress dress each morning and evening, who knew her most intimate secrets and fears, might find herself becoming a confidant and eventually something more. The trust and intimacy required for such service could easily evolve into deeper feelings, especially if the servant was intelligent and attractive, and the noble was lonely or unhappy with their prescribed role in life. The practical arrangements for such affairs required extraordinary discretion and creativity. The servant had to continue performing their duties without giving any sign of the changed relationship, while the noble had to maintain their proper demeanor in public while finding ways to show their affection in private. Secret meetings might take place in the servants' quarters, spaces that were generally off limits to the nobility, but which the noble could access by claiming some household emergency or special errand. Alternatively, they might meet in storage areas, unused rooms, or other spaces within the castle that were normally unoccupied. The emotional dynamics of these cross-class relationships were particularly complex, as they challenged not only social conventions, but also the personal identities of both participants. The noble had to grapple with feelings that society told them were not only inappropriate, but actually impossible, while the servant had to navigate the dangerous waters of loving someone whose social position made them effectively untouchable. The power imbalance inherent in such relationships added another layer of complexity, as it was often difficult to determine whether the servant's feelings were genuine or whether they were motivated by fear, ambition, or simple survival instinct. Religious communities, despite their commitment to celibacy and spiritual devotion, were not immune to the pull of romantic attraction. The monasteries and convents of medieval Europe were filled with men and women who had entered religious life for various reasons, not all of them purely spiritual. Some were the younger sons and daughters of noble families sent to religious communities to reduce the number of potential heirs and claimants to family property. Others were individuals who had suffered personal tragedies or disappointments and sought refuge in religious life. Still others were genuinely called to spiritual service, but found that their human nature was not so easily suppressed. The enclosed nature of religious communities created unique opportunities for romantic relationships to develop, as monks and nuns often worked closely together on various projects and shared many of the same spaces and activities. The scriptoriums, where manuscripts were copied and illuminated, brought together some of the most educated and talented individuals in medieval society, creating an environment where intellectual compatibility could easily evolve into emotional attraction. The gardens where religious communities grew their food and medicinal herbs provided another setting where men and women might work side by side, their conversations beginning with practical matters, but gradually becoming more personal. The rules governing contact between male and female religious were strict but not always perfectly enforced, especially in double monasteries, where monks and nuns lived in the same complex under the authority of a single abbot or abbess. These communities, while maintaining separate living quarters and many separate activities, necessarily involved some degree of interaction between the sexes. The celebration of religious festivals, the management of community property, and the care of the sick and elderly all required coordination between male and female religious, creating opportunities for relationships to develop. The affair between a monk and a nun represented perhaps the most dangerous form of forbidden love in medieval society, as it violated not only social conventions but also sacred vows made before God. The consequences of discovery could be severe, ranging from public humiliation and expulsion from the religious community to imprisonment or even death. Yet the shared spiritual context of these relationships often gave them an intensity and meaning that secular affairs might lack, as the participants saw their love not only as a violation of their vows, but also as a kind of spiritual communion that transcended earthly considerations. The practical challenges of conducting such affairs were enormous, as religious communities maintained strict schedules and carefully regulated access to different areas of the monastery or convent. Secret meetings might take place in the chapel during the quiet hours between services, when the space was empty except for the ever-burning sanctuary lamp. The library or scriptorium might provide another venue, especially if one of the lovers was responsible for maintaining the collection or had legitimate reasons to be there at unusual hours. The infirmary, where the sick and elderly received care, could also serve as a meeting place, as the need to provide medical attention might justify the presence of both male and female religious. The emotional and spiritual struggles of religious lovers were particularly intense, as they had to reconcile their human feelings with their commitment to divine service. Many genuinely believed that their love was a gift from God, a spiritual connection that transcended the physical world and drew them closer to divine truth. Others saw their feelings as a temptation to be resisted, a test of their faith and dedication. The conflict between these interpretations could create enormous internal tension, as the lovers struggled to understand whether their feelings were holy or sinful, whether they should embrace them or fight against them. The discovery of affairs within religious communities sent shockwaves through medieval society, as they challenged some of the fundamental assumptions about spiritual life and moral authority. The public nature of religious vows meant that any violation was seen not only as a personal failing, but also as a betrayal of the entire Christian community. The punishments for such relationships were designed not only to punish the individuals involved, but also to serve as a warning to others who might be tempted to similar behavior. The consequences of being discovered in a forbidden affair varied depending on the social positions of the participants, the specific nature of their relationship, and the political climate of the time. For nobles, discovery often meant social exile and the loss of inheritance rights, effectively destroying their position in society. For servants, the consequences could be much more severe, potentially including physical punishment, permanent banishment, or even death. For religious individuals, discovery meant not only the loss of their spiritual vocation, but also the forfeiture of any security or social position that their religious life had provided. The physical punishments for sexual transgressions in medieval society were often brutal and public, designed to serve as deterrents to others who might be considering similar behavior. Whipping was a common punishment carried out in public spaces where the entire community could witness the consequences of forbidden love. The number of lashes and the severity of the beating varied depending on the perceived seriousness of the offense, but the public nature of the punishment was always intended to maximize the humiliation and social damage to the participants. Exile represented another common consequence of discovered affairs, particularly for those of higher social standing who might be considered too valuable to execute or too dangerous to keep nearby. The expelled lovers might be sent to distant religious communities, foreign courts, or remote family holdings, effectively ending their relationship and removing them from the social circles where they had committed their transgression. This separation was often permanent, as the social and economic barriers to reunion were usually insurmountable. The psychological consequences of discovery could be as devastating as the physical punishments, as the lovers had to cope not only with the loss of their relationship, but also with the destruction of their social identity and future prospects. The shame and guilt associated with forbidden love could last for years, affecting every aspect of their lives and relationships. Many struggled with depression, anxiety, and other mental health challenges that had no recognition or treatment in medieval society. Yet even in the face of such severe consequences, forbidden love continued to flourish in medieval society, testifying to the power of human emotion and the persistent desire for personal choice in matters of the heart. The very harshness of the punishments seemed to intensify the passion of secret lovers, creating a sense of urgency and preciousness that made their stolen moments together all the more valuable. The knowledge that their love was forbidden, that it challenged the very foundations of their society, gave it a revolutionary quality that ordinary sanctioned relationships could never match. The stories of these secret affairs, passed down through letters, court records, and literary works, provide us with a window into the emotional lives of medieval people that is often missing from the formal historical record. They remind us that beneath the rigid structures of medieval society, human hearts continued to beat with the same hopes, fears, and desires that drive us today. The lovers who risked everything for a few stolen moments together, who climbed castle walls and crept through gardens for the chance to whisper their feelings in the darkness, were not so different from lovers in any age, struggling to find ways to express their deepest emotions in a world that seemed determined to keep them apart. In the end, the story of forbidden love in medieval times is not just about the specific individuals who dared to defy social conventions, but about the eternal human struggle between personal desire and social obligation, between the needs of the heart and the demands of society. It is a story that continues to resonate today, reminding us that love has always found a way to flourish, even in the most constrained and dangerous circumstances, and that the human spirit's capacity for both passion and sacrifice remains one of our most enduring characteristics. Chapter 6. Prostitutes, bathhouses, and brothels. In the shadowed alleyways and bustling marketplaces of medieval Europe, where merchants hawked their wares and pilgrims sought lodging for the night, another kind of commerce flourished quietly alongside the more respectable trades. The world of medieval cities was complex and layered, filled with contradictions that modern minds might find difficult to reconcile. While the church preached virtue and chastity, while noble families guarded their daughters' purity with fierce determination, there existed parallel worlds where different rules applied, and where human desires were acknowledged, regulated, and even taxed by the very authorities who publicly condemned them. The medieval approach to sexuality and commerce was far more nuanced than the simplified morality tales that have come down to us through centuries of historical interpretation. In the great cities of Europe, from London to Paris, from Florence to Cologne, municipal authorities found themselves grappling with the reality of human nature in all its complexity. They discovered that attempting to suppress certain aspects of human behavior entirely often created more problems than it solved, leading to a pragmatic approach that balanced moral ideals with practical governance. The legal status of what we might euphemistically call the oldest profession varied considerably across different regions and time periods, but it was rarely the simple matter of complete prohibition that we might expect. Many medieval cities developed elaborate systems of regulation and taxation that acknowledged the reality of commercial sexuality while attempting to control its most problematic aspects. These systems reflected a sophisticated understanding of urban life and the need to balance competing interests, from public health concerns to moral teachings, from economic considerations to social stability. In the great commercial centers of medieval Europe, where traders from distant lands mingled with local craftsmen, and where gold changed hands as readily as gossip, the authorities recognized that certain services would inevitably be in demand. Rather than pretending otherwise, they chose to regulate these activities, creating designated areas where such commerce could take place under official supervision. These red light districts, as we might call them today, were carefully planned and managed, with specific rules governing everything from the appearance of the establishments to the behavior of both proprietors and customers. The city of Southwark, across the Thames from medieval London, became perhaps the most famous example of regulated commercial sexuality in the English-speaking world. Here, under the authority of the Bishop of Winchester, a complex system of laws and regulations governed what were euphemistically known as the stews. The irony of having such establishments under ecclesiastical authority was not lost on contemporary observers, but it reflected the practical realities of medieval urban governance. The bishop's authority in Southwark was temporal as well as spiritual, and the revenues generated by licensing and regulating these establishments helped fund various charitable and religious activities. The regulations governing these establishments were remarkably detailed and comprehensive, covering everything from the physical appearance of the buildings to the personal conduct of the women who worked there. The houses were required to be easily identifiable, often painted in distinctive colors or marked with specific signs that would alert potential customers to their nature, while also warning away those who might be shocked or offended by such activities. The interiors were subject to regular inspection, with specific requirements for cleanliness, lighting, and the separation of different activities within the establishment. The women who worked in these licensed establishments occupied a unique position in medieval society, neither fully respectable nor entirely outcast. They were required to register with the authorities, to undergo regular health inspections, and to follow specific codes of conduct that governed their appearance, behavior, and business practices. In return, they received a degree of legal protection that was unusual for women of the lower classes, including the right to appeal to the courts if they were cheated or abused by customers or proprietors. The daily life of these establishments followed rhythms that were carefully regulated by both law and custom. The hours of operation were strictly controlled, with most activities confined to specific times of day when they would be least likely to interfere with respectable commerce or religious observances. The women were required to dress in particular ways that would identify their profession, while also maintaining certain standards of modesty and cleanliness. Many were prohibited from wearing the same styles or colors as respectable women, creating a visual code that helped maintain social boundaries even in the midst of commercial transactions. The economics of these establishments were complex and varied, involving not just the women themselves, but also a network of proprietors, servants, suppliers, and officials who all derived income from the trade. The proprietors, often women themselves, had to navigate between the competing demands of profitability, legal compliance, and social acceptability. They were required to maintain their establishments according to specific standards, to pay various fees and taxes, and to ensure that their employees followed all applicable regulations. The customer base for these establishments was equally diverse, ranging from wealthy merchants and visiting nobles to common laborers and traveling craftsmen. The services offered varied considerably depending on the establishment's location,